To me with our host, Kelly Springer. Kelly, how are you? And I know you're excited about our guest today.
I am very excited. I love always getting a little bit of an insight before we start these podcasts. I'm extremely excited to hear the story. Today's guest is Dana Sutton, a tutor, a coach, a parent, a business consultant, and a children's author with decades of experience helping young people grow into strong, emotionally intelligent individuals. And I love that. So as an educator myself, I cannot wait to welcome Dana on today's podcast. Her book is Maddie Finds Her Place, and welcome, Dana.
Hi, thank you very much for having me here. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
So tell me about this book. I know there's a whole story behind it. Tell us a little bit about it.
This is my second children's book, and it is based loosely on my daughter, one of my children's life story. Maddie, my husband and I adopted Maddie. And Maddie came to us out of a youth homeless shelter here in our city. And she'd had a very difficult upbringing, lots of in and out of different biological families' homes, in and out of foster care, a lot of turmoil, a lot of disruption, and ultimately ended up under the care of the ministry and was living in a homeless shelter. And I, at the time, my husband and I were just dating. I was divorced. My adult children were out in the world, going to school and doing their thing. And I had a 5-bedroom house with myself and 2 large dogs in it. Then I thought I'd really like to do some renovations. Maybe I'll rent out a couple of these rooms and get some students in. I had a background in tutoring everything from preschool right up to first and second year university. And we have 2 large universities, colleges in our area. So I thought I'll list a couple of the rooms for rent and we'll see what happens. And I got a phone call the one day from our local Boys and Girls Club, which happens to be an advocate for the youth homeless shelter here in town. And they reached out and said, "Are you interested in taking a child on a young adult program?" It's called. And I said, on a youth agreement. And I said, "Well, what's a youth agreement? Explain that to me." And they said, "These are kids that for whatever reason, it's been determined they can't live in their biological family home. They have to be 16 years old. They have to be in school. They can potentially have a part-time job. There's a lot of very rigid rules they have to be following. And if they do that for 6 months within the shelter system, the ministry will give them what's called a youth agreement and basically pay a landlord their rent directly. And so they have a home to live in, but you're really just a landlord." And I thought, oh, okay. And I said, "Tell me a little bit about this child that you have in mind." And they gave me a little bit of background. And I said, "Does she have any learning disabilities?" And my interest in that was really just in terms of I'm a tutor anyway, so that's not a deal breaker. It was just out of curiosity. And they said, no learning disabilities. And I said, "Does she have any sort of addiction issues?" And they said, "No." I said, "No criminal past or nothing like that?" But they said, "No." And I thought to myself, that's a child then that shouldn't be homeless. There's no real reason for this. And I said, "So really what you're telling me is that the family they came from was dysfunctional beyond their ability to make any changes?" And they said, "Yes," basically. So I said, "Well, you're over and we'll meet and we'll see." And my first concern was she going to be comfortable with our dogs because they're not small. Our big guy is 110 pounds and our little one is 85. So I have to have a certain personality to be able to deal with that. So they brought her by that day and she'd actually had her wisdom teeth out that morning. So she was a little bit on the loopy side of things and very nervous, but we met and she seemed very well spoken. And I was really impressed with the idea that here was this 16, almost 17-year-old child who very clearly had an extremely tumultuous background and was still in school and was still trying to make the right choices and the right decisions and was looking desperately for people to help her. So after we met, I said, "Sure, we'll do that." And she moved in. Now, when she moved in, we were told very specifically, "You are a landlord. This isn't a parenting situation. It's just, you're the landlord. You can have typical landlord rules, but you're not a parent." And I said, "Okay, that's fine." And I own my own business. So my business has a particularly busy season from sort of October to the end of April here in Canada. And so she'd been with me for about 5 months and I was at work and I had been at work late a couple of nights a week that week. And my son was in town to do 6 weeks of his journeyman electrician schooling before he went back to his job. And he called me one night at work. He said, "Mom, I think you need to come home." And I said, "Oh, okay, what's going on?" And he said, "I'm not really sure but Maddie doesn't have any food in her cupboards. And I've bought her dinner 3 nights in a row. And I think there's something going on. I think she needs some help. And I said, okay, I'll come home. So I came home, and that was the first time where I sat down with Maddie and really pushed to integrate a little bit and to find out really more specifically what the issue was. And once we got to the sort of what was going on in that particular case, I realized that this was not a child that was ready to be independent. Regardless of what the ministry was telling us, this was a kid who needed some parenting and needed some intervention and needed some support. And so that was the starting point. And we started to integrate more. And I sat down with her, and first of all, that night, and said, there is no reason for anyone in this house to be hungry. We have a kitchen full of healthy foods, and regardless of what's in your cupboard, the kitchen's full. Eat. And that was the first time I think anybody had ever really said to her. I learned from her later, as we got more in depth about her background and that kind of thing, that she'd had experiences where she wasn't allowed to eat until everybody else was finished. She'd had experiences where she was force-fed foods that she knew she didn't like, and that was it. That was all you had. So there was a lot of very tragic history around nutrition with her that she still struggles with today. It's something she's learning and she's working on. That was the starting point. Ultimately, at the time, my husband and I were dating, and eventually we got engaged and we decided we were going to get married. And he brought up the idea of adopting Maddie. And at the time, Maddie was still very involved with her biological family. And so I said to my husband, that's not our role here. She still wants a relationship with her biological family. She's still working on it. So our role is to support that opportunity and just be here, pick up the pieces when things go sideways, and to help her out. But eventually, Maddie was probably about 20, I think, when it became very apparent that biological connection was finished now, that she wasn't interested in rebuilding anymore, that she had come to a point where she was ready to cut those ties and move forward. And by then, my husband and I were engaged to be married, and he brought it up, or I brought it up, I think, this time. And he was like, yeah, I'm still 100% interested. And we ended up adopting Maddie. So she was 21 by the time we adopted her, which seems a little bit silly in terms of she's an adult, she's 21, she qualifies. But I think it was really good for her. She changed her name, and that's how she became part of the family. So this story that we wrote, Maddie Finds Her Place, it's obviously a children's book. So it's written in such a way as to not really go into details about the backgrounds and that kind of thing. But the idea behind it initially was I wanted other children who were in similar positions to see themselves in Maddie's story. But what really became interesting to me was when I said that to Maddie one day, she said, that's not why you need to write. You need to publish the book. And I said, why do I need to publish the book? She said, we all know we're there. We all see each other. We know exactly which kids are which and who needs help and whose family isn't doing what they need. I want other adults to see that we're out there, because I'm not the only one who needs help. So that was for me really a profound, oh, you're right. That's a big thing. So
How old is Maddie now?
Maddie now is 25. Yeah. So she's doing pretty good. She's got some post-secondary training under her belt, and she's got some health issues that we're dealing with and we're working through. And as I said, she's still got a lot of baggage to unpack, and she's working through that process. But overall, she's doing really well. We're really proud of her.
How does she feel about you writing the books about her?
It was very interesting. So this was not the first book I wrote. The first book I wrote was a book called You Can Do Hard Things. And that was really based on my biological children's upbringing, where when they came to us and said, I can't do this or I need help with that, the answer was always, I will help you solve your problem. And it's lighthearted and it's fun and everything else. And then when I wanted to write the second book, I wanted to write Maddie's story. And as I said, for me, I wanted other kids to see themselves represented in it. So I wrote the book. At the time, Maddie was living in another city working, and I sent it to her and I said, here's the manuscript. But I said, this is your story. So you get to decide if this goes out into the world. I said, because people will know who you are. If I publish this and we do well, which we're trying to do, and we're trying to get the stories out there, people will know who you are and they're going to know it's your story. So I said, it's 100% up to you. Do you want us to publish it or not? And if not, that's fine. We have other stories that are in the works as well. And she said, okay, I'll read it and I'll call you back. And so she called me back a couple of hours later and she said, I cried for an hour, but I want you to publish it. And I said, okay, all right. And she loves the pictures. We really worked hard on the book to include a lot of things that Maddie had told me along the way. For example, one of the things that she was really difficult for her as a foster child moving in and out was every time you went somewhere new, you only had the backpack on your back. You only had the bag on your back that you were carrying with you. And so if you look in the book, in every page, everywhere Maddie goes, she's got her backpack. Another thing that was really important to us in that book was just the idea that, again, and this was more on my side, is I wanted people to realize the lady, quote unquote, that Maddie meets and eventually makes a home with was in the background of every image in the book. With the dogs. And that was also a message for the kids too, is the people who will help you are there. You just have to find them.
It's really cool. It's such a special story, and I'm glad you're sharing it, but it is interesting of Maddie's take that it's the adults that need to learn.
Yeah, and she's not wrong. I've done a few different interviews and I've had a few times where people have said to me, why did you take her in? And my response is always surprised, why wouldn't you have?
Yeah.
Right? I had a house, I had the homes, I had the experience. I was an educator and a coach. I had lots of experience with teenagers. And this was a child who clearly needed help. So why wouldn't you help?
I think that it's a great question. And I think if our society were to be open to that even more, then we would have way less crime and way less issues that we are having today, and a connectability, which I think is lacking as well.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's a tendency for people to walk through with their blinders on, worried only about what's right in front of them. And the problem is eventually all those problems you're not looking at on the side end up in front of you. So if you address them earlier, then it's a lot easier to deal with. It's a lot easier to deal with a 16-year-old than a 29-year-old addict who never got help.
Absolutely.
So Kelly, it's like you listen to this and say, okay, this is what the overall mission in our lives needs to be to help others. If we're not putting ourselves looking at someone else, and that's what Anna was able to do, and that's what you do with nutrition education for all.
Yeah. It's really cool. Dana, a part of my history is I was the dietitian for Hillside Children's Center, which was a place where kids go to live. They have gotten in some form of trouble, but there's real issues at home.
Yes.
So they've been taken out of that. So the same that Maddie was in. And I was the dietitian for these children, and I was able to change around the menus. And we were able, with just tweaking the menus with more protein, more whole grains, educating the kids, we were able to get them off half their psych meds and improve their quality of life, their mental health. It was truly amazing. And I had never had interaction with that population, particularly on so many medications. And they were just highly drugged to keep them quiet. And it changed my life because I had a 3-month-old at the time. And I couldn't believe how much impact we were able to have. And that's why we've now started this education in school districts. But I think Maddie's not alone. There's so many things with neglect, abuse. Food comes into play a lot with that. And I'm sure it sounds like Maddie's still struggling a little bit with that to this day. And we can truly address those issues by understanding where that comes from. And the kids also, we had fun. We would take them to the grocery store. We had some outings, and we would come back and cook the food so they knew how to do it, and experiment with new foods like tofu and things that they would have no idea what they were. I didn't know your story prior to this, but it's just interesting of how our lives do connect, right?
Yeah, it was Maddie. Of course, it took some time for me to get all of the different stories out of Maddie, and I still only know a fraction of them. But it really amazed me how often food and nutrition was involved in those stories. And either being withheld or being forced or being used as almost a carrot and a stick kind of way. And it's had such a profound effect on her that things like the smell of a specific food can trigger an anxiety attack because it brings back the memories of a specific incident that was very traumatic to them. And one of the things that we've realized over the years with Maddie is she doesn't always know where that anxiety comes from, but it's not a traditional anxiety. It's more of a post-traumatic stress response where it's a smell or a sound or a vision, a glimpse of something that just triggers some kind of fast event and her body goes off and it's a physical response. And I think that's something else that a lot of people don't realize is that physical response to the anxiety, it's real. You can't pretend that it's not. That's a real body function that is responding to that stimulus.
And then it's one of those things too, like how do you then teach the tools that go in and I think that's where your mentoring and tutoring, giving her the tools to be able to handle when that happens and how to feel better about that.
Yeah, the first step really was just by me talking. When she and when I first started getting involved with her, more involved with her, as you said, after that first phone call from my son, and she would say things to me at various, you don't understand because I was a terrible person back then. And finally I said to her one day, okay, let's sit down and talk about this. Tell me what you did. And she said, what do you mean? I said, tell me all of it. Tell me all of the terrible things you did that made you a terrible person. She started she was very hesitant at first and she would tell me one or two things. And I said, okay, what else? Because that's not terrible. Keep going. And we were about an hour and a half into that was the first sort of really significant conversation about the past. And I said to her, Maddie, you haven't yet listed a single thing that one or both of my biological children hasn't done.
Right.
And they've never been beaten for it. They've never been kicked out for it. They've never been physically, emotionally, mentally abused for it. That is normal kid behavior.
They don't feel like they're terrible.
No, and they don't feel like they're terrible people. Like it's okay. And I said, I went on from there and I said to her, has anybody ever told you it wasn't your fault? And she said, what do you mean? I said, Maddie, it wasn't the 2-year-old in the room that was the problem. It wasn't the 5-year-old. It wasn't the 8-year-old. It wasn't the 12-year-old. I said, it's not even the 15 or 16-year-old. It was the adults around you that were incapable of providing you with what you needed. And I said, none of that is your fault. And she said, no, nobody's ever told me that before. I said, they should have. That should have been the first thing anybody told you. You were not the problem. You're not terrible. It's not, this wasn't about you. This was about them. So let's start building some of that confidence back and that knowledge that you can, and I said to her, even if you had done something truly terrible, it's done. And that's not who you have to be moving forward.
Right. No, I was privy to all of the charts. And so I got to see the stories. And it was horrific, actually. It really changed the way I looked at things and saw things. And again, having children young, I had a 2-year-old and a newborn. And of just how I was going to do things differently. And I think it really did transform everything. And I'm so glad Maddie had the opportunity to be with you. And I think it's so special. And thank you to people like you that do this work. And my mom, so we started with Big Brothers and Big Sisters, and she was a counselor my childhood. So my childhood, teen years. So I got to do a lot and volunteer a lot and hoping to get back into that more. And like I said, with the education in school districts and being able to make nutrition and education fun for all. It should be for all. So that's so cool. Thank you very much for being a part of today's show.
Thank you for having me. And if anybody's interested in the books, they can be found at danasuttonbooks.com.